This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. This episode and the next episode will be a bit different than normal. These two episodes feature the fight of the century, at least the fight of the end of the 19th century in the United States. In the 1880s and 1890s, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison squared off against each other 2 times for the office of President of the United States. Each man won and lost a campaign against each other. I wanted to find out why this happened and why we don't know more about this fascinating time in history. In today's episode, we are joined by Ryan S. Walters, author of 2 books on Grover Cleveland. You could call Ryan a Grover Cleveland aficionado. He will lead us in a discussion of this not well-known president. Now, of course, a big thanks goes out to Ryan S. Walters, and links to learn more about Ryan and his works can be found at ryanswalters.net or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies, on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or just send a good old-fashioned email to my good old-fashioned email account, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. So I really do hope you enjoy these 2 episodes. After you've listened to both episodes, make sure your vote is counted on Facebook and Twitter. Who should win? Leave your thoughts in the comments and make sure you like and follow us on social media while you're there. And I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen. I want to welcome back Ryan S. Walters to the show. Ryan is an independent historian and author of several books. Ryan is particularly the author of a book that you may be familiar with from a previous episode, Disaster at NASA, a book about the Apollo 1 tragedy. But today we're going to focus in on a book that he wrote about Grover Cleveland. And when I saw that he had written a book about Grover Cleveland, I was like, we're talking about this book. There's no choice in this, because I've always been fascinated with Grover Cleveland. Just a little bit of setup where I'm coming from is that I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York. And, you know, basically every year in history class, they would always mention, we had 2 presidents who were from Buffalo. And throughout my childhood and adulthood, I read a lot about Grover Cleveland and how he fit into the history of Buffalo and the U.S. And also, when you start to read about him, he had very interesting policies as a president that definitely did not fit the mold. And I can see a lot of reasons why Grover Cleveland's maybe not one of the most famous presidents that we've ever had. And I think that just in the end, Grover Cleveland deserves a lot more limelight than he often gets. If not for anything, is that he was the only president with 2 non-consecutive terms, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. But so today I thought we'd really focus in on Grover Cleveland's meteoric political rise through the ranks, and especially somebody who had just a really strange political career that almost defies explanation. So let's explain it. Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in Grover Cleveland?
Well, I'm a historian. I teach history in North Texas at Collin College. And of course, I'm a writer and published author. When I was in grad school, we were looking for topics for a master's thesis. And I had read a little bit about Cleveland. I really didn't know that much about him. I had read bits and pieces of him. And I'd picked a topic on Grover Cleveland's trade policy. I was kind of interested in trade policy at the time, but it kind of grew out of that. I started doing the research on all of that. I ended up not doing my master's thesis on that, but Cleveland stayed in my mind. And I started reading more about Cleveland. I thought, wow, this guy's pretty good. I like this. I like his policies. I like him as a person. I had actually been to Buffalo when I was just a kid. I was like 11. My grandparents took me to Niagara Falls, but I didn't know anything about Grover Cleveland at 11, which is kind of interesting. But you're right. He did have a meteoric rise. I mean, he went from a mayor to president in just a short period of 4 years, which is incredible.
Yeah, I even have my own connection to Grover Cleveland. He signed our actual house deed in Buffalo. But so I have this connection with him. But I think the first thing to maybe start off is Cleveland came from fairly humble beginnings. Where did he come from? Because it's always interesting to look at where somebody came from and how that kind of guides their later life.
Of course, his father was a minister, and of course, ministers then are not like some of our ministers today. Some of our ministers today have private jets.
Yeah,
that he had a long line of pastors, and one of his brothers became a pastor. So it was sort of a tradition. Now he didn't, and of course, he did what people did in those days. I mean, you had to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You had to, make your own way in the world. He eventually, as a young man, moved to Buffalo. He had an uncle there. He had planned to go west, maybe to Ohio, but he had an uncle there in Buffalo, and his uncle Lewis said, you ought to just hang around here, stay here. I can help you, because he was influential in Buffalo, knew people, and of course Cleveland ended up being going into law practice, and it was his uncle Lewis in Buffalo that got him started because he knew a lawyer. In those days, you didn't really have that many law schools. I like to tell my students that. I said most lawyers didn't go to law school. And Cleveland's, no exception to that, because there just wasn't that many law schools at the time. And of course, my students always are puzzled. And I said, well, how do you become a lawyer? Well, you went to a law office and became a clerk, and you clerked in that law office, and you started reading the law books. You went to court with a lawyer. You learned how to do things. You learned by doing, not by, not in a formal law school. So that's what he did. And he became a very, very good lawyer in Buffalo before he became interested in elective office. And you mentioned sheriff. That was really the first office he was really elected to. He was assistant district attorney for a while during the Civil War, but then later in the 1870s, he was a one-term sheriff of Erie County.
It's interesting. I think it's interesting to put Buffalo into context at that time, because it's not, you kind of have to imagine the exact opposite of what people probably have in their mind of Buffalo today is like cold. It was still cold back then, but pretty much an economically dead place. This was really the entrepot for the entire West as the terminus of the Erie Canal, and the launching off point for anywhere to go out west. You had to go through Buffalo. So it was a fabulously wealthy city. And I think it was at that point in the late 1800s, maybe the 8th largest city in the U.S.
Yeah, it was actually big. You don't think about that today, but you're right. It was big. And I have some descriptions in the book about Buffalo and the good parts and the bad parts. I mean, there were certainly a lot of bars and houses of ill repute, but that was the case with any city in those days that you went to. So it was a pretty hopping place, particularly like you said, the canal and the traffic on the lake. There was a lot of that type of element there.
And I think that ties into Cleveland's career. What was his sort of political base going into? Why did somebody who was a lawyer, what was maybe his financial situation at that point and his career situation in the early 1870s to get himself involved in politics at all?
His financial system, I think, was pretty good. He was a pretty frugal guy. He was a fiscal conservative in his policy. A lot of politicians are fiscal conservatives in their public policy stance, but then you look at their private finances and it's a train wreck. Thomas Jefferson was the same way. I mean, he was perpetually in debt and things like that. Cleveland wasn't, because he was a bachelor. He didn't get married until he was in the White House. So he was a bachelor all those years throughout his 30s and 40s, and of course that gave him the opportunity to, when he made money, to save a lot of it. He usually saved about half of whatever salary he got. He only lived on half of it. He was pretty frugal, but he apparently did pretty well. I mean, he was not poor by any stretch of the imagination, and he was a pretty good lawyer. He had a good reputation around Buffalo as being a good lawyer and being an honest lawyer and an honest man. That's one of the reasons that sort of propelled him into politics, is because of his honesty. And when he got in to be sheriff of Erie County in the 1870s, the sheriff's office was very, very corrupt, and he became the sheriff and started cleaning it up. and stopping, some of the corruption and spending money and things like that. One of the most interesting stories was, and of course, in those days, if you committed a capital offense, they'd take you out and hang you. I mean, they wouldn't wait around, no lethal injection. They put a rope around a tree and hang you. And of course, basically what they did was they would hire a professional hangman to come in there and do the dirty work. Cleveland said, well, I'm not going to spend the people's money to really do a job that I should be doing. So he actually pulled the lever himself for 2 convicted criminals. So that's just how he thought. He said, this is, a public office is a public trust. It's my duty to do these things, not to charge taxpayers, not to frivolously spend their money. And so they really liked it. He only served 1 term, but the people in Erie County said, this guy's pretty good. And a few years later, he ran for mayor. And you got to remember, though, Erie County and Buffalo, it was pretty heavily Republican area. Cleveland was a Democrat. So that's even more remarkable that he was able to get elected to these offices and have the respect he did, even though he was in a minority party at the time.
Yeah, and he was. It's kind of interesting that he was sheriff until 1873, and then he doesn't really get involved directly in politics, or at least in political office, for about almost a decade later. What was he doing during that time? Was he involved in politics? Was that on his mind?
Yeah, he was part of the local Democratic organization there in Buffalo. He and some of his other friends, Oscar Folsom, people like that. So he was involved in the electoral process. But he just practiced law during that time until the opportunity to run for mayor came along in the early 1880s. And he took the opportunity to do that. And a lot of people came to him. You got to remember the situation in the late 19th century, particularly in the northern states. I mean, we know what was going on in the southern states, Reconstruction. And then, of course, when that was over, the reimposition of white supremacy and that kind of thing. In the North, it wasn't about that. It was corruption. These rings that ran these cities. These corrupt organizations that were just, stealing taxpayer money. It was just really a pretty awful thing. And all these cities had these rings. And a lot of people just got tired of the corruption and said, we need an honest guy to come in here and clean up the city of Buffalo. So he ran and won the mayorship of Buffalo and started cleaning it up. Started stopping all the frivolous, crazy spending. I mean, government's the same. It doesn't matter when the era is. It's the same today as it was then. I mean, politicians, they get somebody else's pocket, they're in somebody else's pocket, somebody else's wallet. They're going to spend money on whatever. He came in and started vetoing bills and stopping all the spending and earned the nickname the veto mayor and started cleaning up the corruption.
Who were his constituency? Because there's a lot of apocryphal stories, and I don't know how true it is, that he was really connected with the immigrant community, and as a bachelor they said that he would go to all the beer gardens, and there was even beers named after him. Was that true, or was that something, because it's always hard to kind of pull apart later ideas that get attached to someone to what the actual reality was?
Yeah, he used to go to the German beer halls. Apparently there's a pretty big German population, so much so they had German newspapers in Buffalo at the time. And he'd go in those beer halls. And of course, Cleveland, he was a guy who was a pretty big guy. He was pretty, wasn't fat like Taft, but he was, and people get Taft and Cleveland mixed up, but Cleveland was a pretty stocky guy. He liked his, German food and go have a beer. He'd go to those beer halls and stand up on the table and, give his political speeches during the campaign season. So he pretty much reached out to everybody. He saw the people really as the same, no matter who they were. He said, everybody needs good government and honest government and accountable government and economic government is important for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are.
And that was really scandalous. And if we have to put ourselves in that Victorian mindset of the upper crust in a place like Buffalo in the Gilded Age, would that be appropriate to call that the Gilded Age? I guess, that's pretty much that the upper crust, or the people who had the money, found that sort of thing of hanging out at a beer hall or talking with immigrants as something as sheer scandal.
Oh yeah, and I'm one of these days I'm gonna publish a full biography of Cleveland. I've written a lot on it. One of these days I'm gonna get around to doing it, finishing it up. But I'm gonna call it Man of the People, because that's really what it is. Who he was. When you look at his career throughout, he was a man of the people. Now he gets tagged as being a businessman's president. When you see what historians have said about him, that he's a businessman's president. He was in the pocket of Wall Street and the big banks. That's really not true when you really dig into his policies. So he considered himself a man of the people. A lot of the poorer element really liked him and supported him because they believed he was on their side, fighting for what they needed. If anything, he was actually against the business community in a lot of ways. So a lot of what historians have said has been flat wrong. But again, he didn't look at people different. He didn't put them in groups. He just saw them as the people, and the people should have good government.
I think that's something of the view of Cleveland that we'll definitely get into, but maybe just for the moment, let's plow through with his career, because this is, it's pretty shocking that within 1882, he's elected mayor. Only about a year later, he's elected as governor. Like, what propelled that? You're booming. Buffalo's a big city, but even in the scope of the 19th century, it's still not New York City. You're not in the heart of where everything's happening. How does somebody go from one-term mayor of Buffalo to the governor in about a year?
Yeah, he was only mayor for a year. And I think it goes to, at least what I point to, is the corruption. The corruption had just gotten so bad in these cities and these states, and people just had enough. It was just terrible. The Tweed Ring in New York City, which is probably the most famous, ring in American history. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, they portray the Tweed Ring very well in that film. Boss Tweed and all the corruption and just stealing tens and tens of millions of dollars from the government, because they control the government. They had to, they elected the candidates, and the candidates got big contracts for people, and it was kickback. It was just this corrupt circle, and people just had enough of it. They were looking for somebody like Cleveland to clean it up, and they were looking at what he did in Buffalo. In the 1 year in Buffalo, the party leaders that were reformers that wanted to reform the state said, this mayor in Buffalo is doing good work. Maybe he ought to be our candidate for governor. So that's why it was what he was doing and the success he had in Buffalo. And he was not afraid of these powerful people, these powerful special interests, we would call it today. He wasn't afraid of them at all. He wasn't afraid to go after them. He wasn't afraid to veto bills and things like that, and to kill their funding, and to publicly call them out. And so reformers, and that movement was growing in the Democratic Party in New York, said, this is our guy. This is the guy that needs to be the governor. And of course, when he got to the governorship, he was doing exactly the same thing in Albany to clean up state government. And that's what propelled him to the White House. People said, this is what we got to have this guy to clean up D.C. So it was the time he was in and his policies together is what propelled the rise. And you see that all the time. Almost everybody that's elected president, it's for some specific reason, most of the time. Whether it's, they're tired of the other party, or, the economy falls apart, so they go to the next party. There's some reason why. It's not just, it's not in a vacuum. So again, people were looking at what he was doing, his courage, his honesty, and his willingness to get in, roll his sleeves up, and clean the messes up. So that's what propelled him like a rocket. If you want to use that analogy, to go from 1881 to be a small town mayor to be sitting in the White House 4 years later. Show me another example of that. In our modern time, maybe Obama, sort of like that, but that's very rare.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I'm always get confused. Was the Tammany Hall, were they Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah, Tammany Hall was Democrats. That was a Democratic machine. That was the Tweed Ring.
What did they have to say about this kind of, bumpkin's probably not the best term, but somebody who's a reformer, who's of their party, who's coming to basically cut into their action?
Yeah, Tammany Hall had been around a long time. That's the Democratic machine in New York City, and of course that was the Tweed Ring. The Tweed people got in charge of that. And of course, they hated Cleveland. They hated him. It's kind of interesting. They hated Roosevelt too. They were in different parties, but they were still reform minded. That's the last thing they wanted to see was Cleveland, and particularly somebody as tough and, if you will, I guess, hard-headed. He was not going to be intimidated by Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall had intimidated a lot of politicians over the years, and they were used to either buying them off or intimidating them, but they couldn't intimidate Cleveland. He stood up to the ring in Buffalo, to Tammany Hall while he was a governor. And of course, they were kind of happy to see him go into the White House. Well, maybe he'll leave us alone. Now he's in Washington, and we can get back to stealing from the people of New York.
What was his core of support? I mean, nobody comes up from nowhere without some sort of team. Like, who was his core supporters, his core donors, the people who were like his support structure through these steps?
Of course, he was a Democrat. He was a Jeffersonian Democrat, a conservative Democrat. Of course, we know what the Democratic Party today stands for. In those days, the Democratic Party was the party of limited government, states' rights and all of that kind of stuff. The Republican Party at the time was more seen as the party of bigger government. So he had support of Democrats, at least the more conservative Democrats. As far as individual people, it's kind of hard to say because now we know everybody that donates to a campaign. If you give any money to a candidate or a campaign or a PAC, I mean, you can go with a couple of clicks on your computer and you can find out exactly who donated to who. In those days, you didn't have any of that. It's just wide open. Anybody could, they could just go to any, like I said, beer hall, give a speech. They could pass the hat. People could throw money in. There was no limits on anything like that. There wasn't a lot of laws as far as voting. A lot of the elections were very, very corrupt in the late 19th century. People talk about corruption today, and I said, well, I can show you a lot of elections in the late 19th century where 3 or 4 times as many people voted in a particular area that lived in the area. I mean, it was people routinely voted 4 or 5 times, and so you had to kind of overcome that. And he was able to do it. There were just enough people that had finally gotten fed up with things to realize we got to clean this up. And he was also good at getting Republicans. In the book, I call them Cleveland Republicans. You heard of Reagan Democrats. I call them Cleveland Republicans. There was a number of Republicans that crossed over to vote for him because even they realized, we've got to get somebody honest in office for a change.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting you bring up because we always have to kind of refocus ourselves of, that the parties and the way the politics of now are not necessarily the politics of the past. And what was the situation? The Republicans had been fairly much in control of the Congress and the presidency for about 25 years. Was there a sort of maybe a people getting tired of that rule, for lack of a better word, of that, the Republicans running everything for so long, just kind of a fatigue?
Yeah, that's why the Republican Party is called the GOP, the Grand Old Party. They only emerged in the 1850s. Their birth date is 1854. But with Lincoln's election and, of course, the Civil War just destroyed the Democratic Party because for a long time, and that's why the Republicans controlled the White House for, 24 consecutive years, basically, because the Democrats were painted as the party of slavery and secession and treason and all of that. So it was a long time before the Democrats got back in charge of anything. But you're right; it was kind of one party fatigue. They had run things in Washington for so long, and of course, the Democrats probably really won the election of 1876 with Samuel J. Tilden. That was pretty obvious that they actually won that election. But again, the Republicans maintained the White House. So by the time Cleveland came along, again, the corrupt situation and of course, the Republicans being in charge, he was able to win because he was a good candidate. And a lot of the candidates the Democrats had through the years were just not very good candidates. I mean, they were just trying to find somebody to be the nominee to get killed. I mean, that's basically what they were doing, is finding a sacrificial lamb. But, Cleveland was different. He was a young guy. He was a reformer, a conservative. And, of course, he won. And, of course, you mentioned 2 non-consecutive terms. When he ran for re-election in 1888 for the presidency, he actually won the popular vote. But in those days, the big swing state was New York State. That's the one that would swing an election back. Today, we look at Florida or some of these other states. But in those days, it was New York State. That's what they fought over. And a lot of times, the Irish population in New York City could swing the entire state. And if the Republicans won it, they would win the White House, and the Democrats would. So it helped Democrats to get the governor of New York to be their candidate in 1884.
Let's talk a little bit about what made Cleveland the choice for the 1885 election. Why did the Democrats look to him? Like you were saying, they would put up a lot of sacrificial candidates. Was he looked at as a sacrificial candidate, or did they think that he had a real legitimate shot?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they really were. They were pretty high on Cleveland, and his popularity was growing outside of New York. So again, sort of that more reform element in the Democratic Party was gaining control of the party. You got to remember, there were no primaries. Primaries didn't come along to the 20th century. People won presidential nominations at the convention. You ran your campaign at the convention, and you got people to manage your campaign, and you got, they had campaign staff and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the candidate himself, like Cleveland didn't go to the convention. The candidates didn't go in the convention. In those days, it was seen as a bad thing for you to actually pursue the presidency yourself. Nobody was out giving campaign speeches. You had people run the campaign for you. And that's the same way at the convention. And people went into the convention. In days before the convention started, they started hitting up delegates in different states. What about Grover Cleveland? Of course, there are different senators and other candidates, but they weren't very good. And that's how it was done. Of course, it took money and it took a lot of time and effort, but you had to persuade a majority of the delegates to support your candidate. But again, he was popular enough, and with the problems going on, more and more Democrats, looked to him as the one that could take the White House back and, of course, clean up the country as well. And of course, you have to understand, in those days, the federal government was about 100,000 people. Today, there's millions that work for the government. But in those days, in Cleveland's day, the president appointed every single person to office. It wasn't the civil service system that just came out in the 1880s, but it was very small. There wasn't anything such thing as career bureaucrats. The president appointed everybody. And so when the Democrats won control of the White House, guess what? Everybody got swept out and Democrats came in. And we're talking about even down to the local postmasters in every town in America. He appointed those people to office. So they're political jobs is what they. So yeah, they would fight like heck over the White House, because if the Republicans get in, it's their people are going to get the job. And of course, Cleveland was a civil service reformer. He wanted to start changing that because it's corrupt the way it worked. So that was part of it too. So they're going to fight hard for the best candidate to try to win so they can control the machinery of the government. Of course, when Cleveland got in there, it was kind of interesting. He didn't remove all the Republicans. He said, well, if they're doing a good job, I'm going to leave them. Why get rid of them? So we got to change this system. And of course, that sort of upset some people in the party, some of the more machine type people in the party. But again, he had the backing of the reform element of the party, and it was growing by the day.
What was that election like? Who was he running against? And was corruption the main issue? Were there some other issues at play?
He was running against the perfect guy to run against for his campaign. If you're running an anti-corruption campaign, the best candidate you can run against is a guy who's corrupt as he can be. And the candidate was James G. Blaine of Maine, longtime politician, had a lot of political offices. He had been the Speaker of the House and a lot of different offices, and he was a senator at the time. And he was the candidate. He was the nominee, James G. Blaine, who was so corrupt. They had a little jingle they sang about him. James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. He'd been involved in all kind of corrupt deals, even when he was Speaker of the House. So he was the perfect guy to run against Cleveland. It was the perfect contrast. And that's what they exploited, was his corruption. And Cleveland's public record was clean. Of course, what happened was they started digging into Cleveland's past, and he had a little bit of stumbles in his personal life as a younger man that they tried to exploit, because they couldn't do anything with him as far as his political career. It was pretty stellar. What are you going to say about him? He won't let us steal. What are you going to say? So they found a little bit of an issue that he had. There was a woman in Buffalo back in the 1870s named Mariah Halpin, and she had an illegitimate child that she said was Grover Cleveland's child. And of course, she was a woman of questionable virtue, and apparently a lot of men visited her at her house. And whether Cleveland did or not, I don't know. I think his friend Oscar Folsom there in Buffalo also visited this lady in question. And when she had the child, a boy, in the 1870s, she named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland. So you decide who it belonged to. But Cleveland was a bachelor. Oscar Folsom was married. And Cleveland, I think, this is my position on it, he realized this is going to destroy my friend. They were best friends. They were really, really close friends. And Cleveland took responsibility for the child and basically took the blame for it. He paid child support. The woman was actually a drunk. Cleveland, in his capacity as a lawyer, actually went to a judge and got the child removed from her home and put it in an orphanage to better take care of him and continue to support him. Of course, that came out in the campaign that he had this illegitimate son, and, he had been, in other words, his private life is questionable. Blaine's public life's questionable, but Cleveland's private life. Of course, his campaign aides, when that story was about to break, they came to him and said, hey, you better lie about this. We better come up with a cover story. He looked at them in the face and said, I ain't lying about it. Because Folsom had already died. It had been very easy just to say, no, that was Oscar's and that was his problem. But Cleveland looked at his aides and said, I am not going to trash my dead friend's reputation to win an election. He said, we're going to go out there and stick with the same story. If I'm elected, fine. If I'm not, fine. So that's the kind of guy he was. He said, I'm not throwing him under the bus. I'll take the blame for it. I don't believe it was his child, but we'll never really know that. It doesn't really matter. So the issue really came in the campaign, and it got ugly and nasty with all this stuff slinging back and forth. So the issue was very simple for the people. You want a guy who's got a stellar public reputation with maybe a little bit of a problem in his private life, or somebody else who really doesn't have any problem in his private life, but he's corrupt as he can be in his public life. So it's public versus private morality. And people overlooked, the situation with Cleveland and said, we need somebody that's going to come in and clean the government.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting is that somebody who, it seemed that label gets tacked onto him that he was a philanderer and that he was, so corrupt in his private life, which there really isn't that much evidence for it, but you could see, like I was saying earlier, that how much of the things that he did, that he wasn't at all the tea parties and hanging out at the exclusive clubs that were so important for the aristocracy, because that's pretty much what those people, what they were. It was the aristocracy, especially in a place like Buffalo at that time, in New York City, these clubs that everyone was in. And you have this guy who's going to, German beer halls and that sort of thing, that was scandalous to them. And so tacking that on to somebody, it probably didn't, and the fact that they probably liked a lot of the public corruption didn't help things.
Well, I always talk to my students. I said, people hate politics today. They said, well, it's so dirty and nasty. I said, you ought to go look at the 19th century and see the stuff that they did back in the. Every ugly name that they could come up with to sling at somebody, they would. And it'd be put in all the papers. And one of the things they tagged Cleveland with was he was a drunk, a public, and that was what they got there. Well, he liked to go to the German beer halls, and of course he liked to drink beer too. And he'd been involved in a scuffle or two when he was a younger man. People have a little bit too much to drink. He got in at least one street fight as a young lawyer, and so they take little things like that and say, well, he's just nothing but a drunk. And of course, he's a moral, his morals are questionable and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of ugly names that went back and forth. But remember, the candidates themselves were not necessarily out there campaigning. These were people that were running the campaign across the country for them. Most of them stayed home and let the campaign be run in their name. Cleveland didn't give any speeches running for president. Now, Blaine made a few appearances, and it was an appearance in New York that actually turned the state in favor of Cleveland. In those days, you didn't have any public polling, but they were usually pretty good at being able to determine how the race was going. They had their own ways of doing that. And of course, Blaine was at a speech in New York where a reverend was making some remarks, and he tagged the Democrat Party as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, which angered a lot of Irish Catholics in New York City. And a lot of Irish Catholics generally voted Republican. A lot of them switched and voted Democrat because Blaine didn't say anything about the remark. He was there, but he didn't really catch it and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not what I'm saying. But that's a pretty tough thing to say. Rum, Romanism, and rebellion. It's a bunch of drunk Catholics that support slavery and all that. So a lot of these Irish Catholics said, well, if that's the Republican position, I'm voting Democrat. And so that was one of those, gaffes late in the campaign. It was in October before the election that swung the state towards Cleveland.
Continuing with a little bit of Cleveland's background, he wound up marrying a woman, Frances Folsom. Was that around this time or was that a little later?
He married Frances Folsom, who was the daughter of his friend Oscar Folsom. Folsom had died in the 1870s, and Frances was just a child. But because Oscar and Grover were very close friends, Grover was basically her caretaker. And she was a lot younger than him. And he married her in 1886 while he was in the White House. He was about 47 or 48, about my age, and she was 21. So, which is, people, my female students cringe at that. And I said, well, that's the way they used to do things, have that disparity.
Yeah, that's not as outlandish as it might be considered today.
Of course, he was her caretaker, and he when her father died, he took care of the estate and made sure she was in school and that kind of thing. But they were close, and they ended up getting married. He had a ceremony right in the White House in 1886. So she's still the youngest first lady in American history at 21 years old. I mean, think about that one.
What was because I kind of want to focus more in on the big picture. What was maybe the big picture of his Cleveland's first term in office? Kind of the main idea of it.
Well, the big idea he had, of course, he was a fiscal conservative, very frugal, and he quickly got the reputation of he was the veto mayor in Buffalo when he was the governor, and in just a few years, he vetoed 200 bills as the governor of New York. So he became the veto governor. And when he was in the White House, they called him the veto president because he was the 22nd president his first term. There was 21 other presidents before him. And in just that one term alone, he vetoed more bills than all 21 previous presidents combined. He vetoed 414 bills in a 4-year term. A lot of those were pension bills. Remember, the war had been over by this time, about 20 years, the Civil War, a lot of veterans, a lot of wounded veterans. That was a huge constituency of the Republican Party. They had a veterans group, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was their veterans organization that lobbied the government for more pensions. And they were giving out pensions like candy, and they were basically turning it into a welfare program. All you had to do in those days was if you had only served 90 days in the Union Army, you didn't have to have any combat experience, and you had an injury, you could apply for a pension. It didn't matter how you got the injury. You could have got drunk and fell off the roof and broke your leg, and you could say, well, I served 90 days in the Union Army, they would give you a pension. And if the pension office wouldn't give you the pension, you went to your member of Congress and said, hey, they wouldn't give me a pension. They would put a private pension bill on the floor just for you. They'd say, this is for Ryan or for Stephen for his pension. And a lot of those would pass. And so a lot of those vetoes were these private pension bills. And he would examine them and say, this guy, and one of them, which cracked me up, was one guy had to, said he was going blind because he had chronic diarrhea. I mean, it's just crazy, wild things like that people were just trying to get into the federal treasury. He said, this is supposed to be a role of honor, to honor our wounded vets, not a welfare. So that was one issue. The other issue was the tariff. It was sky high. That was a Republican issue. And he said, it's just too high. We've got a budget surplus, that we're paying down the national debt from the war. Why do we need such high tariffs? So he went after that issue in his re-election year of 1888, which his aide said, don't do that. That's a suicide mission. He said, what's the use of being reelected unless you stand for something?
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Let's talk a little bit about that election of 88. So the tariff was an issue. What else was going on, and who was Cleveland running against?
Yeah, the tariff became the issue because he in those days, remember, in the State of the Union address we see today, it's become nothing but a political speech. I mean, it's a rah speech. Look at what I'm doing. You really don't learn that much in a State of the Union address. And the Constitution just says you have to update the Congress every so often. In those days, they didn't do a speech. They just wrote out a very long document every December, and they sent it to Congress when they met in December. And of course, don't go read any of them. They're not not fun to read. This is how much money we've got. This is what we spent. This is what we're doing with this country. It's a very boring thing to read. So he did something unique in 1887, in December of 87. He sent his annual message, and the entire thing was about the tariff. It wasn't about anything, cutting the tariff. And of course, for Republicans, that's waving a red, cape in front of a bull to do something like that. That was their cardinal principle, and it had been since Lincoln. And of course, so he was setting the stage for 1888 to make the tariff the issue. And it's really a tariff election. They tried to get a bill through Congress, and it was defeated. So they weren't able to cut the tariff, but that became the issue. And he was running against Benjamin Harrison. He was the grandson of President William Henry Harrison, which everybody probably knows, served and was elected in 1840. And he's known as the president who served the shortest term. He only served 30 days in office and died. But this is his grandson. He had been a brigadier general in the Union Army, and he had been a U.S. senator. So he was the candidate. And of course, the Republicans were running on the tariff. And of course, again, New York City helped swing presidential elections. And of course, there was a big issue in 1888 that swung New York back in the Republican column. And that is, there was a guy in California using a British sounding name, sent a letter to the British ambassador to the United States in Washington. And he said, I'm a British citizen. He said, I was a British subject and I moved to the United States. I'm now a citizen and I'm living in California. And who should I vote for president? Who would help England the most to be president? Well, the ambassador thinks he's writing to a former British citizen. He just writes a letter back and said, well, we really like Cleveland. We think Cleveland's tariff policy, lowering the tariff, is going to help England's economy. Well, the guy was not really British. And once he got the letter back in the mail, he turned it over to the press and said, look at what the British are saying. Well, think about the Irish-English dynamic throughout history. Now, it's not that way now, but in those days, if you were Irish, you hated England with a passion. Now, how do you think all those Irish voters in New York felt when they said, hey, England wants to see Grover Cleveland as the president again? They switched back to Republicans. And so it was that Lord Sackville West, he was the ambassador, the Sackville West Affair is what it's called, really cost Cleveland, New York, and the presidency, even though he won the popular vote. He won the popular vote. But again, that doesn't matter. It's electoral votes that matter. So Cleveland won the popular vote, but again, he lost because he lost the state of New York.
Yeah, that's interesting because I didn't know that one, that Cleveland had won the popular vote. There was a president right around that time who had won the popular vote. Was that Tilden, you said?
Tilden won the popular vote by 500,000 votes in 1876. But that was the election because Reconstruction was still going on in the South. 3 southern states, Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, still had troops there. It's obvious Tilden won those states. He was one electoral vote short of winning the presidency. All he needed was one elector in one of those states, but they were disputed. I mean, they sent electors, 2 slates of electors, a Democratic slate and a Republican slate, and it was an ugly thing. It drug on. It was actually not handled, and in other words, the president-elect was not known until 2 days before the inauguration when they had to cut a deal with Democrats. And Democrats did because Southern Democrats wanted those troops removed and some other things for the South. So they said, okay, we'll let the Republicans win, but you're going to do these things. And that was only 2 days. I mean, 2 days before the inauguration, the country didn't know who was going to be the president. But Tilden was rightfully elected. No question about that. Even Ulysses S. Grant believed that.
Yeah, I think there is such a theme that carries through this time period is there was a lot of ugly politics, different politics than what we might think about today, but it was a very ugly political time.
Nasty, a lot of money. Like I said, there was no limits on campaign. So if you needed the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and people like that to throw in literally millions of dollars, they would. If they were scared of a particular candidate, which happened in 1896. So there was no limits on any of that stuff. There was no, I mean, of course, there's no campaigns. It was newspapers that we had to campaign ads. You didn't have, radio or television yet, but it was newspapers, and it was dirty. All those campaigns were nasty, dirty affairs. But again, think about what I said earlier. It was about controlling the Washington, apparatus. It was about that. And so, yeah, they're going to fight over it.
Now, usually, even though Cleveland would have been popular, having won, so many votes, usually losing an election, especially a presidential election, is the death knell of a political career. What was this kind of intermission period for Cleveland like?
And he had no intention of running for president. I think he was happy. Well, I had my turn. And he liked hunting and fishing, and of course, when the Republicans got in, they were sort of they went in with gusto. When Harrison got in, that the Republicans were in charge of the House and Senate, and they went on a spending spree. They started spending money, and again, they passed these elaborate pension bills. The same thing that Cleveland had tried to stop, they put in full force. There was a pretty good surplus that Cleveland had worked to build up in the Treasury. They spent every bit of that. There was an effort to take over the elections, federal takeover of elections. I actually wrote a little article on my website the other day because there's been an effort today by the Biden administration to do the same thing, that passed this election reform bill that basically could give the federal government control over the elections. They were trying that in the 1890s. That effort was beaten back. So there were a lot of things. There was a remember, Cleveland had tried to cut the tariff. So when the Republicans got in, they passed a brand new tariff, the McKinley tariff in 18, and raised them up even higher. I mean, all of these things were going on, and people came back to Cleveland and said, hey, we need you to step back up to the plate. He didn't want to do it at all. And they were asking him to campaign for the midterm elections and do these things. And he really wouldn't do that. He said, look, I'm retired. I don't want to get involved in that. But he realized what was happening to the country. He said, everything that we work to do, they're tearing apart. So, you got an ex-president. He's going to be your best candidate. So the 1892 election was a repeat of 1888 Harrison versus Cleveland. And the people were really upset at what the Republicans were doing. And Cleveland won the election pretty easily. As a matter of fact, he still could have lost New York State and still won. The Democrats won control of the House and the Senate. And so when they entered office in 1893, this was the first time since James Buchanan in the late 1850s that the Democrats controlled the White House, the House, and the Senate. So it had taken them that long to get back in charge completely of the government. And of course, once they got in charge in 1893, the wheels came off the wagon, literally, with the Panic of 1803.
And that seemed to be the big theme of Cleveland's second term was this Panic of 1893, which, if you read about it, it was in many ways worse than the Great Depression, or at least the fundamentals of it. But the outcomes were very different. What did Cleveland do? Would you say, was that the main issue of Cleveland's second term, was this panic or depression? Really, that's what we would call it today. Is they called them panics.
Yeah, they called them panics, and I guess in a way they were. I mean, like the stock market crash in 1921. I mean, that's a literal panic. I mean, it's an economic panic, and that's what they called them. And in those days, in the 19th century, they happened in about 20-year intervals. These panics, about every 20 years or so, give or take, we had a panic. There was one in 1819, 1837, 1857. So one in 1873, and then in 1893. So you see about every 20 years there's a panic. And this one, a lot of this had to do with silver. The issue back in those days was monetary policy. We didn't have a Federal Reserve, and there was no central bank at all. Congress determined what the monetary policy was, and of course today we don't really handle cash now. It's all like electronic, but your cash is Federal Reserve notes, and that's all you deal with. In those days, they had greenbacks, the paper money. They had silver and they had gold, all in circulation. And you had to know the values of these things, or you could really lose your shirt. So the issue was, when we were on a gold standard, that dollar, that greenback, was backed by gold. We were on a gold standard back in those days, which we're not now. Nothing backs our currency except our confidence. It's really worthless, not really worth much of the paper or whatever it is it's printed on. But in those days, it's backed by gold. But you had a lot of agitation from people who wanted to inflate the currency and mine and coin silver and put it into circulation as a way to help poor people, to help debtors. If you were a debtor, you want inflation. Inflation's good for a debtor. You can pay your debts over time. But of course, Cleveland was a gold Democrat, and part of the Republican Party, all of the Republican Party was part of the Democratic Party. But this silver agitation was beginning in the 1890s, and during that intermission between Cleveland's terms during Harrison's administration, they had upped the silver purchase. They passed a law called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and they began purchasing millions of ounces of silver and coining them and putting them in circulation. So a lot of economists that have studied the 1893 panic call it the silver panic, because it was inflation, silver inflation. And so Cleveland came in, and the very first thing he said was, we've got to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and stop purchasing the silver and putting it in circulation. In other words, stop the inflation, which is probably a pretty good policy we need to adopt today. I mean, you keep putting money in circulation, you're going to get inflation, which is what we're seeing today. But that was silver. So that he called Congress into a special session and did that, even though it was politically tough, because you had a big silver component of the Democratic Party and a gold component. They're fighting with each other, but they got it repealed, and it split the Democratic Party wide open. I mean, it blew it sky high. And so he really didn't have a very good second term. It was pretty raucous for him. And of course, after that, they went after the tariff and they were able to lower it a little bit. So Republicans are wound up and you got silver Democrats that are wound up. So Cleveland was really without any friends. But over the course of his term, the economy started growing again, which he doesn't get credit for. You mentioned it being maybe worse than the Great Depression. In those days, we didn't have the numbers we have now. Now we know every little number about the economy. In those days, they really didn't. It's a little harder for economists to tag that exactly. But I think you're right. It certainly rivaled the Great Depression in its severity. Unemployment was probably around 18 to 20%. And remember, this is a time there's no welfare, so there's no unemployment. You're on your own. The government does not do anything to alleviate these panics. They don't bail out businesses. There's not any paycheck protection program. There's no unemployment. There's no welfare. There's no food stamps. Some of it on a local level, or even some of the states did, but the federal government didn't do anything about it. And that attitude was starting to change. More people were saying, the government needs to step in. And there were suggestions that they come up with what we would call today a New Deal type program. There was Cleveland said, we're not doing anything. So you're a party, you come in power, and the economy just craters. Guess who's going to get the blame for it? The party in power. Even though it went back to Republican policies, Democrats got the blame for it. They lost control of the Congress in the midterm elections. And then, of course, in 1896, the Republicans were able to, Cleveland wasn't running for another term, but they were able to win back the president.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it seems like what Cleveland did, at least I'm an armchair historian and I'm an armchair economist, I guess, that those policies, those silver policies were probably going to lead to something probably not great at some point. And so Cleveland kind of pulling the knife out of the wound at that time caused the panic or the depression, but that was probably something that was going to come along one way or the other.
Yeah, there was a lot of other issues. I mean, most of these things are very complex. You really can't point to, we're spending, and a lot of it was railroad construction, a lot of railroad construction in the late 19th century, and the government was, subsidizing a lot of that. And these railroad companies were building railroads all over the place, whether they needed to build them or not, because they were getting money from the government and land from the government. And that's what caused the Panic of 1873 and probably contributed to the Panic of 1893. When you just get too much building. And when I teach in my classes, I like to use the analogy of 2008, the housing crisis. What was driving that? There was too much house flipping and all that kind of, it just kept driving the price of everything up until that bubble busted. Same thing happens there in 1893. A lot of times these economic panics, they have the same cause. It's a imbalance in currency and things like that. Because one of the first businesses that collapsed in 1893 was a railroad. They went bankrupt. A lot of these railroad companies went bankrupt. Some of them many times went bankrupt. They were just mismanaged. So there were a multitudinous causes for this panic, just like there was for 1929 or any other one you want to look at.
A good way to wrap up things, and we're at this point, what was Cleveland's legacy? So he's leaving the office in the end of the 1890s. What did people think about him at that point?
Wasn't good. It would have been nice to know what his poll numbers would have been if you could have polled it. One thing I looked at was a diary of one of his cabinet officers, and he was talking about how unpopular Cleveland was at the end of his term, even among Democrats, again, because of what he'd done with the silver and things like that. And he said, he's basically by himself in the White House. He said nobody came to see him, even his fellow Democrats. So he was very unpopular. And of course, the Democratic Party changed after that, because in 1896, the nominee of the Democratic Party was William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan and Cleveland did not see eye to eye on a lot of things. They actually hated each other. They were political rivals on most things except foreign policy, because they were both anti-imperialists. But it was so bad after Bryan basically wrecked the Democratic Party. In 1900, people were writing letters to Cleveland saying, would you want to take a third term? And he said no. But a lot of people thought he was going to run again in 1900 or 1904. 1908, they thought he was, because he ended up dying that summer. But when Teddy Roosevelt was in office in 1904, he was concerned. You can look at his letters. He was very concerned that Cleveland was going to run. He said, I think Cleveland's got the presidential bee in his bonnet. But he didn't. He didn't have any intention to do it. He said, I've done all I'm going to do. But the point is, a lot of those old Jeffersonian Democrats realized, hey, we've got to pull this party back away from Bryanism And so he went from being very unpopular to back being popular in his own party.
And really, at that point, the Democratic Party in the next generation, you get Woodrow Wilson, who was a very different political person than somebody like Cleveland.
They didn't like each other either. They had some run-ins because Wilson was at Princeton, and Cleveland went to New Jersey. He'd been born there, and he'd gone to New Jersey. He actually was on the board of trustees, and he's buried in New Jersey. He was on the board of trustees at Princeton, and they had a bunch of run-ins with Woodrow Wilson when he was the president of Princeton. So it's very interesting that they had a connection as well. But yeah, Wilson was a very progressive Democrat, and of course, then you get FDR, and you just go down the line. The Democratic Party, starting with William Jennings Bryan, began to move left step by step, and it has continued to do that. While the Republicans have continued, at least in economic matters, to be more conservative as they the parties are not the same as far as what they believe. In some ways, they are the same, but in other ways, they're not.
It's interesting, too, that Cleveland, during this 1890s, he had his big falling out with all of his supporters in Buffalo as well. And that's one of the main reasons he was so basically disgusted with the aristocracy. He didn't go back. Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't go back to Buffalo. He had some homes and some like vacation homes, but again, he ended up back in New Jersey, but where he's buried. But yeah, his legacy is sort of mixed. I mean, it sort of changes over time. When they did the first presidential poll of historians, Arthur Schlesinger's famous one in 1948, Cleveland was pretty high. I mean, he used to be ranked in the top 10 of presidents, but he's sort of fallen down to sort of the middle of the pack. But that's what I've been trying to do is sort of rehabilitate him a little bit, particularly among people who are more conservative in their thought process. He's somebody to emulate.
I guess a good way to wrap up today is what should our takeaway be from Grover Cleveland? Why should we know more about him?
Well, I think, and I'm hoping he kind of starts to rise a little bit, particularly when people look at how he handled an economic panic, which we don't handle that way anymore. We handle them by throwing everything at it, which usually prolongs them. In those days, in the 19th century, they were short because the government didn't interfere with them. But I think particularly if you're concerned about spending and the debt, he hated debt and massive spending, and he worked hard to try to change that, to balance the budget, to build up surpluses. How many surpluses have we had over the years? I mean, apparently during Clinton, we had one or two. Think about this. The Civil War ended in 1865. In 1866, we ran a surplus. We ran a surplus every year from 1866 to 1893 when the panic hit. Every year we had a surplus. We don't have those problems today of too much money in the Treasury. But the system's different, But I think there's certainly things that we can look at from that vantage point. We can certainly look at his character and the way he viewed people and his truthfulness. I mean, when he ran for president the first time in 1884, the New York World endorsed him for 4 reasons. They said, these are the 4 reasons why we want to endorse Cleveland. Number 1, he's an honest man. Number 2, he's an honest man. Number 3, he's an honest man. Number 4, he's an honest man. They were tired of the corruption too. So I think those are issues we can look at. It'd be nice to have somebody like that today.